So in criminology, when people study this nature of desistance, people who talk about desistance as more of a process, as more of a gradual phenomenon than a cold turkey kind of situation, often talk about the desistance process as being kind of zigzag in nature. What I mean by that is, if you think about this chart, you think about a person's behavior over time and, specifically their offending behavior. Ideally, when you think about desistance, you would think about slowly over time that person committing fewer and fewer crimes, eventually leading to them not committing crimes at all anymore. That would be, in a perfect world, somebody's idea of the gradual process of desistance. But we know that that doesn't actually happen, that very few people actually follow this perfect trend. And what most people tend to do is they kind of zigzag and they kind of oscillate, committing sometimes more crimes, sometimes less, until eventually their frequency of offending goes down. So if you think about, the differences here, think about if you were trying to measure a person like this by just counting their number of offenses over time. You might not really agree at different points on this graph that the person's desisting. But what developmental criminologists like to do is look at the overall trend over time to try to make this statement that even though at some periods in the process they may have committed one or two more crimes than normal, than you would typically see in this trend, the process, the overall nature of it is one that kind of bespeaks a desistance process. So not all criminology theory has made really pointed statements about why people stop committing crime. If you think about most of this semester, most of what we've talked about in this class has to do with onset. What causes people to commit crime? If you think about, what you came into this class to learn, that's probably what you thought of. I want to understand the processes that lead people into committing crime. And depending on which theories you guys liked the most in this class, you probably have developed your own kind of opinion about this. But what very few of these crim theories really, extensively talk about, especially some of the older kind of the classic theories, is desistance. What causes people to stop? And, in a perfect world, if you have a really clearly well-developed theory, you should be able to explain both of these because we know that both of these things happen. Most people don't start committing crime and do it for the rest of their lives. So there are some people that have had something to say about the desistance process. And often, people's explanations of this process are very different, often really butting heads. So Gottfredson and Hershey's theory, if you remember, it's the general theory of crime, which most people refer to as the theory about low self-control. If you remember, they had a very specific opinion about the relationship between age and crime. Essentially, their opinion had to do with a concept known as maturational reform. Essentially, their argument is everybody desists. Everybody eventually stops committing crime because they simply mature out of it. There's a simple, inexorable aging process, according to them, where once we enter into adulthood, we develop physically, intellectually, our affect, our mood becomes stabilized, and that in and of itself, they call it maturational reform. This kind of unescapable aging process that we all go through. That's what causes everybody to commit crime. So for them, because almost everyone stops, and almost everyone stops at pretty much the same age range, finding out why this is the case, why people desist, was not very interesting to them. What they were more interested in, if you remember, was finding out how people got to be different in the first place. So for them, yes, everybody desists from crime. Even people with low self-control do decline over time. But they don't really think of it as being something that you can explain by social processes. They thought of it more as just as we mature as humans biologically, mentally, we eventually stop committing crime. Developmental criminologists have an incredibly different take on the desistance process. Most other criminologists are very unsatisfied with Gottfredson and Hershey's take on the desistance process. And developmental criminologists talk about desistance as being attributable to things like changing behavioral patterns, cognitive shifts, things like suddenly starting to think that there's more at stake, more at risk, causing some people to stop committing crime. And developmental criminologists also, one of their critiques of Goffredson and Hershey's argument is, yes, most people stop, but not everybody does. That aggregate age crime curve that you guys have seen so many times in this class is an aggregate. And for a developmental criminologist, that aggregate trend is masking the trends of multiple other kind of smaller groups within our society. So just ignoring the underlying variation between that age crime curve is very unsatisfying for a lot of people. If you think back to someone like Terry Moffat and her dual taxonomy with adolescence limited offenders and life course persistent offenders, that theory in and of itself is an attempt to kind of break out the age crime curve and talk about some people who really don't seem like they desist. A small number of people, the life course persistent offenders, but nevertheless, it's a chink away at this idea that everyone follows this process, why bother studying it? Think about some of the other theories we've learned about in this class. Again, not all of them, when they were originally conceived, made actual statements or developed opinions about desistance, but over time, as we've thought about this more in the field, people from things like rational choice theory and social learning theory have chimed in and done research to try to figure out, okay, if this theory explains the way into crime, how might it explain the way out of crime? So if you think about rational choice theory is all about decisions. You make a decision to commit crime if the costs of committing a crime are outweighed by the benefits that you foresee for committing a crime. There's a high likelihood you're going to commit crime. Well, according to people who are interested in desistance from the rational choice perspective, the decision to desist is also a decision just like the decision to enter crime. And according to rational choice theorists, and we'll talk about a more specific one a little bit later, but essentially what happens in adulthood, according to these theorists, is you start to really reappraise the costs and benefits of crime. Things that you didn't perceive as being high costs in young adulthood and adolescence suddenly become more important. You suddenly have more things weighing against any potential benefits that you might see. So that's kind of one way to think about how a theory you've already learned about might be able to get applied here. Thinking again about social learning theory. So social learning theory was all about you eventually becoming reinforced and imitating and conditioned over time to feel that committing crime is an okay thing to do to get you what you want, that committing crime is going to get you rewards, acceptance, actual property, going to make you feel better, things like that. Well, people who are interested in desistance from this perspective would argue that those same variables can explain both processes, that the social learning variables that explain initiation, things like imitation, modeling, reinforcement, can also explain the desistance process. Because, according to them, one thing that happens as you enter into mid-adulthood is you have much less exposure to those friends and opportunities that you used to have presented to you all the time that were reinforcing criminal behavior. And you get less exposed to criminal people that you would model and try to imitate. According to them, what happens in adulthood for most people is you start to get exposed to more pro-social people, more kind of good, positive types of opportunities that get presented to you. And you learn from those just like you learned from the bad influences earlier. So for them, it's all a learning process. And the reason why most people desist in adulthood is they start to learn to value conventional attitudes and behaviors and goals that prior to that they had not necessarily been exposed to, not necessarily gotten behind. Think about life course criminology, probably the type of criminology that has had the most to say about the desistance process. Everything about life course criminology had to do with continuity and change in a person's life. In other words, wanting to be able to explain not only why prior behaviors can tend to lead to similar negative outcomes, but trying to understand how, even despite some prior behaviors, some people are able to change. So those facets of life course criminology make it an ideal place to study the desistance process. And for the most part, life course criminology is embedded in the social control kind of family of criminology theory. Essentially, the idea being they're going to get their explanation for the desistance process in a person's social life. They're going to look at things like social turning points, transitions that you make socially, educationally, with family, marriage, job, things like that. All these social elements of a person's life, for a life course criminologist, are going to be the most important reasons why somebody desists from crime. So again, thinking back to Sampson and Lobb and their age-graded theory of informal social control, they're really one of the only theories we talked about earlier in this class that had a very definite idea about why people stop committing crime. Because according to them, if you can develop strong adult social bonds, that's going to be enough, that's going to be a big enough transition that it will cause the turning point and cause you to start desisting. So for them, again, it's a process, but it's all about social bonds. Even if you are someone who has a negative past, all of these bad traits, you spent time in detention centers, all of these things happen to you in childhood and adolescence. If you are able to do this, if you are able to form meaningful, strong social bonds as an adult, that can be enough to help you desist. And they point to things, for examples of these strong adult social bonds, they point to things like having a good quality, strong attachment to your spouse, having a good marriage might be enough. Having investment and care about a job that you've gotten. Becoming attached and impassioned in military service. Again, all of it is about having strong quality for these things. If the quality of these adult social bonds are strong enough, they can be enough to turn someone.